America, my name is Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live every week, and today I'm going to hit you up with a premarital / pre-pregnancy questionnaire because, as you can imagine, I think that most premarital counselors are hacks. And even if they've succeeded in themselves, having a successful marriage and good kids, it's not as if they did so with the quality of introspection and conscious intentional action that they presume, so that there are other structures working in their benefit that inure to their benefit that maybe they didn't identify. So most people are bad at most things, and this includes counselors and premarital counselors and pre-pregnancy people. But I'm going to give you a kind of a quality of questionnaire which will help you not to raise degenerates. And I'm going to define degeneracy broadly as kids who do less well in important things than their parents. If your kids are doing less well in important matters than you are, you've succeeded in reproducing degeneracy. I do not want you to do that, so I'm going to give you a qualitative questionnaire which I think can get in front of a lot of the non-obvious determinants of degeneracy. All right? So partners, gather around, and I think you should gather around with your partner and watch this together. It'll make everything easier, especially down the road. And first of all, you should hash out, if someone's pregnant, who's going to teach that kid to read? And when and through what system? Who's going to teach that kid to read? Now, you could trust the schools. You could be one of those people who trust the schools. But remember, schools, up until about 5 minutes ago, and I think a lot of schools still do this, were teaching sight words, which is ridiculous. Teaching kids how to guess. Teaching kids to guess. Sight words. It's lazy as opposed to phonics, which I think is a more robust understanding of what's going on, even if there are not the phonetic rules and then there are exceptions. You teach rules and then exceptions and a healthy respect for a contradiction with respect to rules, but you don't just teach sight words, which is lazy, but was very popular for all sorts of awful reasons up until about 10 minutes ago. So who's going to teach your kids to read? You can leave it up to the schools, but I think that's tempting fate. And black people do not think any of these institutions will help you out. So even if the whites leave it up to the schools, you yourself need to understand that one of you, if you care about it getting done, is going to be sitting down, working through teaching your kids how to read, which is perfectly appropriate. It's just going to be one of those things you have to do. And if you haven't decided who's going to do it, then you can't be surprised when your kid doesn't read. All right, so who's going to teach your kids to read? Question number 1. Math. Who's in charge of their math education? Once again, you could trust the schools to do it. But I think that is it's a dicey proposition. I think you need to take control of your kids' math education. This doesn't mean homeschool. None of this means homeschool. But understand that schools are there to supplement whatever you teach them at home, and if they don't hear it from one of their parents' mouths, just don't assume that they know it, right? So who's going to teach you? Who's going to be in charge, primarily in charge, or at least the stopgap? Who's going to notice your kid's math education when it is at par, above par, or below par? Who's going to notice and who's going to remediate that? Whose job does that fall into? Right? Because I think you need to take these things seriously. You could trust the institutions, but black people, one of these institutions really worked for us. So someone's going to have to take it. That doesn't mean you have to do it yourself. Maybe that means that you research Kumon or research something else, but it means that it's ultimately a parent responsibility, because whether a kid can do math, those teachers still get paid and they still get their check. So you cannot expect the teachers to actually teach your kids what they need to know. So of the parents, who's going to be the final responsibility for their math education? And through what system? Sports. What sport are they going to learn? I think it's very important for kids to learn sports, because it's one of the places where they can funnel their energy in a healthy way, and energy and creativity in a healthy way. And they learn a little bit about competition, which I think is also important. And learning boundaries and discipline and self-discipline and self-control, which becomes more and more important in a world where there's freedom, which means conventions won't arrest your fall, nor will they propel you to a certain status. They will just kind of received conventions, you can't trust them, and received prejudices, you can't trust them to propel or degrade your kid. So they need to understand how to compete as autonomous entities. And I think that comes through sports. I think sports are hugely important both for girls and for boys, although for slightly different reasons. But if they're going to excel, someone's going to have to work with them. You can't just trust these leagues to teach your kids how to play any given sport, right? And I think for kids, it's good for them to have a mix of sports. They should specialize and they should have a primary, but I think general adeptness is important, right? I mean, I've only seen good things come out of gymnastics and swimming for kids, not necessarily my own kids because we didn't do gymnastics and swimming directly, but for other kids, and I'd say this generally, for other kids, gymnastics and swimming seem to be like a fine general start. And then you kind of build from there. I would have liked wrestling. I think honestly, the earlier you are, the more contact, the better. I think especially for girls, but so gymnastics, swimming, but you have to come together and decide what sports are they going to do, because you don't want them to be fodder for everyone else when they play. So you're going to, once again, have to teach them. You can't just expect the league or the coach to teach your kids everything that they need to know. You're going to be the one. If it's baseball, you're going to, if you expect your kid to play baseball, but you're not willing to commit yourself to out there playing catch and throwing grounders to them, then you're just you're throwing your kid into a place where that's not going to be, they will not be at home there. That's irresponsible. So you're going to have to, as parents, decide which sports the kids play, and it's going to be based on which ones you feel comfortable working with them with. And I think they should, like I said, play few, so they should have like a primary and a secondary. But I think parents need to understand that it's their job to get their kids ready for practice, just like it's your job to get your kid ready for school. Or your kid will be consumed by my kid, because I took the job seriously to get them ready for practice. So when they go to practice, my kid's just running all over your kid. And I don't want that to be the case. I want iron to sharpen iron, or steel sharpen steel. So, but you need to decide as parents, all right, so which one of us is going to be there, kicking the soccer ball, throwing the baseball around, who's going to be in charge of their sports education, or how are we going to divvy it up, and primary and secondary, and all of this needs to be planned. And not for them to be professional athletes, but for them to learn how to compete appropriately in civil society in all manners of things, right? So there might not be a right or wrong sport or a series of sports, but you have to decide as parents, because it's going to be based on what you feel comfortable training them in or what you're willing to learn. YouTube's an amazing resource in terms of videos on how you train your kids in a different sport. You got to do a little bit of research, but that's part of the job. I wasn't around when I was a kid, and I had to teach myself a lot of things very inefficiently, because for a variety of reasons. But so who's going to teach your kids to read? You got to work that out. Who's going to be in charge of their math education? You parents have to work that out. And you can't just leave it up to institutions, or you can, but I think you're tempting fate when you do that. Who's going to be in charge of their sports education? Either coordinating the coaches or doing the direct instruction themselves. Who's going to do that? You have to work that out. Or, like I said, your kids get eaten by my kids. And I don't think, you don't want your kids being snacked on by mine. Swimming. Who's going to teach them swimming? When and how? Right? You can go in the YMCA and they'll teach them how not to drown, maybe. But if you actually want them to be competent in the water, which I think you should, a parent, most probably is going to be in the pool with them, working with them. Or you're going to pay a ton of money for a private tutor. But, I just knocked this out with my kids over spring break. Spring break was about a month and a half ago, about 2 months ago. It was exactly 2 months ago, actually. I started with them then. It took about all of spring break, but at the end of spring break, they could go 25 meters freestyle, and we went every day. Freestyle, that's all three of my kids. Freestyle and on their back. And now 2 months later, they could swim, very comfortable, good side breathing, all of that. And now I swim laps with them, just I like keeping up with them. But I learned how to teach swimming and the principles of good swimming through YouTube. I had learned through the YMCA, and I grew up in California, so I knew how to swim so-so. But now I swim with a good technique because I had to teach good technique to my kids because I, like a responsible parent, I want my kids to excel me in every meaningful way. So who's going to teach them how to swim? You can't just assume it happens by magic. And you can't just assume it happens by planning. By the way, one thing I didn't take seriously is that swim caps are awesome. I have a hard time finding one that fits my head, but because I have a rather large noggin. But swim caps actually, even if you don't have hair, like I don't have a ton of hair, and like they kind of do something with the noise, and it's a much lovelier experience. So yeah, fan of swim caps in a way that maybe I was indifferent before when I could just functionally swim but not actually swim. But now I can actually do laps and stuff like that. And so can my kids who are a lot younger than I am. But someone's going to have to get in the pool with them. They have to, you guys, parents, have to figure that out. Or you could spend the $1 zillion for the one-on-one lessons. But I think if you're not willing to do the private lessons, or you don't feel like that's a good enough excuse for your use of your money, you have to commit to yourself getting in there with them. The group classes won't do the job. Not in any meaningful way. All right. Spelling and handwriting. Once again, you could trust school to do this, or you could just decide that one of us is going to make sure that it gets done. Spelling and handwriting. Who's going to determine that? And you got to be able to sit down with each kid through their recalcitrance and work that out. You also have to work out how mannered your children will be. Are they going to say please and thank you and sir and ma'am, and maybe please and thank you, but no sir and ma'am? There are good reasons and bad reasons. Like, I have a loose relationship with manners. It's not that big of a deal. But I do see the virtue of a more mannered household, even if I'm not in one right now. So there are arguments both ways. By the way, the virtue of a more mannered household is that it puts a barrier between the immediacy of their feelings and actions and then their words and responses, right? It puts a barrier in immediate, so they learn how not to just say and do what they immediately want. It's always through a mannered interaction, which is actually healthy because a lot of what parenting is teaching kids how to deal with the immediacy and the strength of their emotions. So if manners can force them into a mold where they have to mitigate that immediacy through like a protocol of politeness, that is in and of itself good. They have to, and so I could see the virtue of a mannered household, but you have to decide how mannered your household is going to be. Are they going to call you sir and ma'am and all of that? Or are they just going to say please and thank you, or none of it? They're going to call you Jim or Dad, or I don't know. So you have to work that out. This isn't stuff you should leave to chance anymore in this world, in this modern world where there is no convention to keep your kid from degeneracy. So you have to intentionally do these things that were just done by convention before, right? How important is religious education? You got to work it out. What does that entail? What does religious education entail? I gain a lot of respect for something like Orthodox Judaism, where they have an entire day just to sit and read. I appreciate that with the screens off and all of that stuff. But how important is religious education? What does it mean? I think they need some sort of introspection. How important, and who's going to be in charge of making sure it happens, and how do you divide the labor in that? That's something you need to work out before you have kids, unless you want to raise degenerates. And it has to make sense and be consistently enforced, right? Food. What constitutes a good breakfast? That's something you need to work out. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble with this, but I have a little bit of distaste for skinny parents with fat kids. Because if I see fat parents with fat kids, I'm like, well, genetics isn't working for their favor. Maybe not, but it's often in America, it's not even that. It's just bad habits. But if I see skinny parents with fat kids, I'm like, oh, they didn't have a food plan. They had a food plan for themselves, but then took their eye off the ball. They were just bad parents. They're too busy worried about themselves. Mom and dad go to the gym. They're all fit, and their kids, not. I take that as a fault in the parenting. Also, what food gets into the house? What food gets into the house? That's something you guys have to decide. Because once it's in the house, you can't really blame the kids for eating it. But you can decide what gets into the house. This is one thing my dad was actually very good at. He just didn't let junk in the house. I never developed an entitlement to junk food. Now, outside of the house, you're going to have trouble with school lunches and all that stuff. But you can't fight that. But you can control what gets into the house and like the way they interact with food inside of the house. And if you don't take that seriously, you'll just raise a kid with bad sense of food, a bad relationship with food in a lot of ways, and then that gets ugly, right? So you control, like, you have to ask your partner what constitutes a good breakfast, and then what food gets into the house, because once it gets into the house, like, you've seeded too much ground. But if you could actually get the same, like, I'm just trying to make sure your kids don't end up fat, man. I'm just trying, like, if you could actually understand the importance of controlling what food gets into the house, you'll get in front of a lot of battles. All right. Time management and scheduling. Some people wake up and they make a checklist of their day and they keep a daily planner and all of that. That is a good idea. My mom did that. I never did because she didn't really, like, I had a pretty good memory that got me out of potential things, but as a matter of just orderliness, it would have been helpful, but I never picked up the habit. But if your kid is going to pick up that habit needs to be inculcated into them. It's just not going to happen magically. A lot of parents think that, well, I'm this way, that means my kid will be that way. And then they're surprised when their kid is not that way. And they think, well, what happened? Well, you memory hold or kind of forgot the institution that normalized you being a certain way and then didn't provide that institution for your kid. So it turns out that your kid did not have the same sort of habits that you had because you didn't grow up with the same kinds of institutions that you grew up with. And you didn't take it upon yourself to recreate a reasonable facsimile of those institutions. All right. So time management and scheduling, how are they going to learn it? How are they going to learn it, and what are the implements? Are you going to buy them a planner? Then are you going to check to make sure that they use their planner? Are you going to work with them on what that means and like checklists? Are you like, you got to create the infrastructure for them to live into, and then like be the spring of activity that so in concert they learn how to live into, healthy habits of time management. Chores and tidiness, including oral hygiene. You can't take, see, I'm from California where a lot of people are vain. So, oral hygiene was important, but there are a lot of people for whom oral hygiene is not as important. And even my oral hygiene, I used to brush like 4 or 5 times a day, which, depending on who you talk to, wasn't good, but yeah. So yeah, all of these habits have to be intentionally decided. Who's going to be in charge of that? Who's going to police it? You got to brush your kids' teeth and then teach them to brush themselves, and then like stigmatize not brushing after every meal. And that gets tricky with school, but how is that? That has to come from parents, and you have to decide. You have to have a plan for it, because it's just it's a healthier way to be, and it's not going to happen by magic. All right, and then who picks which books they are to read and why? A lot of people, once again, leave this up to chance and say, oh, they'll just read what they enjoy. Well, that's how you raise a degenerate. No, you need to curate which books they read, and you figure out why. Why? By the way, I struggle with media for my kids in general, and so we don't watch a lot of TV in this household. But one thing I've enjoyed is, and I got this from a few different resources, they said you should watch Airbender: The Last Avatar with your kids. You'll enjoy it. And we do an episode about every other day of The Last Airbender. It's actually the old one, the cartoon, the original cartoon. It's actually lovely, good, strong characters around, and so this is the rare cartoon that I support the whole family watching, or kids watching in general, because I think most of them are trash now. Airbender. All right. Thank you for your time. Let me read through the questions one more time. If you get this video up a couple thousand views, I'll print out the questions. But who's going to teach you kids how to read, when, and through what system? Who's going to be in charge of their math education? Which sports are they going to learn as primary and secondary, and who's going to work with them in order to make sure that they learn it and not just become fodder for the kids whose parents take this a little bit more seriously? Swimming, who's going to teach them to swim and how? Spelling and handwriting, who's going to make sure that their spelling and handwriting is on point? How mannered are they going to be? Are they going to say please and thank you? Are they going to say please, thank you, call people sir and ma'am? Are they going to be even more mannered than that? And there are good reasons why they should be super mannered, and then there's good reasons why they should not be particularly mannered at all. But you guys have to decide what the structure of how manners figure into your household and keep it consistent. How important is religious education, and who's going to sustain it? What constitutes a good breakfast? Ask your spouse right there. Just ask them what constitutes a good breakfast. What food gets into the house? Because once it gets into the house, you can't really control if they're going to eat it, but you can't keep it out of the house. You control what gets into your house. Who's going to teach them about time management and scheduling? Who's going to teach them about chores and tidiness, oral hygiene, and how important are the, like, which chores and all of that stuff? And who picks the books they are to read and why? If you leave any of these things up to chance or what they enjoy, I think you take your life into your own hands. I think it's dangerous business. I think you risk raising a degenerate. So this is that is the pre-pregnancy plus pre-marital questionnaire that I think you should work through, and not take this for granted or think it'll just kind of work out and just, oh, my parents didn't think about this and I turned out fine. Yeah, I think it's very dangerous to do that, because then you end up playing catch up with your kid. Next week's show is going to be on the post money class. The post money class is an entire class of people who are functionally post money. That doesn't mean they're not rich enough not to work, but that just means that they got like a pretty good steady job, and they just don't think about money. And we underestimate, especially among the whites, how large that class is, for whom money is. Now, they still have screwed up families and screwed up everything else, but they aren't problems that money can fix. They're problems because they spent so much time thinking that money could fix their problems that they got all these other problems that money can't fix. But we're going to talk about the post-money class, or what happens when you post money and how much money it takes to be post-money. And it doesn't, like in the Midwest and in the South, it doesn't take, if you come from the right kind of people, it doesn't take that much to be post-money, where your biggest problems are not money, they're just other things. And that's not to say that you don't have big problems, and not to say that you won't raise degenerates. You can very much raise degenerates. It just will be, they're not problems that money can necessarily solve unless you have like a lot of money. So there are quite a few post-money, especially among the whites, who have problems that money can't solve. And I think we need to talk about what their existence even means for our politics, because that means they don't have a politics that's not, they have a politics that's not determined by money either. All right, take care. I will talk to you next week. Oh, look, you're not getting this quality of insight anywhere else. So you need to go to www.funkyacademic.com and kick in $5, $15, and $50 a month. Nobody's trying to make sure that your kids don't end up degenerates like I am. So if you appreciate what I'm doing, which you should, go over into www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, and $50, and I will check you out next week. Peace.